The phone was 6 inches from the mat when Edna Marsh first saw it. She was standing 8 feet back from the black rope with her great-granddaughter held against her shoulder. The child's weight settled in the practiced architecture of an arm that had held many things in many difficult places, and from that distance she had a clear view of the screen's faint glow, and the man behind it, and the way he leaned forward at the waist without crossing the rope, the posture of someone testing a boundary he had not yet decided to break. The crowd around her had gone still in the way crowds go still at Arlington, not by instruction, but by recognition. The collective breath-hold of people who understood something was building and could not yet name which way it would fall. The sentinel's steps continued without variation. 21 steps, south to north. White gloves precise on the M14. The heel of the polished shoe finding the black mat at the same angle it had found on every previous pass, and on every pass before that, back through 3 years of active post at the tomb of the unknown soldier, back through 14 months of qualification in the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, back through something that had nothing to do with this plaza or this morning, but whose weight was carried in the breast pocket of the dress coat and had been placed there every single day. The old woman held the child and did not look away. What no one on that plaza yet knew was that she had carried her own weight for 80 years, and that what looked like stillness in her face was the same stillness as in the sentinel's. Not emptiness, but the specific composure of a person who has learned that certain things are worth standing still for. The morning had arrived cold and clear over Arlington, a Friday in the last week of May 2026, with a pale sky that suggested warmth without delivering it. Jack Nguyen had been on post since 6:45, and he had begun as he always began, in the changing room at Fort Myer, working in the fixed order the old guard required. The order was not ceremony for its own sake. It was the systematic elimination of variation, the deliberate construction of a uniform that would carry the same meaning on this morning as it had on every previous morning, and would carry on every subsequent one. The same way a vow carries the same meaning whether or not anyone is watching it being kept. The coat was pressed to a standing ridge along every crease. The dress cap was leveled by measurement, not approximation. The shoes, maintained through 40 minutes of daily work per pair, caught the fluorescent light with a clarity that was less like reflection and more like a surface that had spent long enough being cared for to have earned its own visibility. The left white glove went on first, then the right, in the prescribed order. When both hands were covered, Jack lifted the rifle from its rest and let the weapon's weight settle into the final line of the uniform. He had done this 643 times in 3 years of active post, and he would have been unable to tell you whether any of those times felt different from the others. The mat on the tomb's plaza ran 63 feet from end to end, and Jack divided it by 21 steps of equal measure, 3 feet each, heel to toe, at 100 beats per minute. At the south end, the turn took 3 counted paces. The M14 transferred from right shoulder to left in one clean arc, white glove to white glove, and he held the turn position for 21 seconds before beginning the northward return. The chrome of the bayonet threw a brief point of light against the tomb's marble on each transfer, and the marble returned the sound of each heel with a precision that carried to the back of the plaza. 21 steps, 21 seconds. The numbers were not decorative. The count of 21 was the oldest formal military salute the Army recognized, 21 guns for the highest honors, 21 seconds at the turn, 21 steps across the face of the tomb. Every sentinel in the old guard learned this during orientation week. Every sentinel who completed the 14-month qualification learned it in the body after, incorporated until it was invisible. until those 21 steps required no more deliberate effort than breathing, which was the only point at which the regiment considered a man ready to walk the mat before a public witness. Jack was 3 years past that threshold. The steps lived in him now. Private First Class Danny Correa had taken his position at the North Sentinel box shortly after the rotation began, and he stood with the controlled tension of a man 9 months into a 14-month process. Jack recognized that quality without needing to study it, the body holding slightly more effort than required, the breath running a half count shallower than rest, the attention a fraction ahead of the action rather than concurrent with it. Correa's footwork was already clean in the way that mattered. He had the steady temperament that held across long rotations when the crowd grew thick and the day stretched into its later hours. He was going to be fine. They did not speak. The watch ran in silence, and what passed between them was the smallest alignment of posture. The calibration of two men whose job was identical and whose silence was its own form of confirmation. The plaza by 8 o'clock held perhaps 40 visitors. A man in his late 60s stood near the center of the rope, with a VFW cap held flat against his chest. His posture, the involuntary standing at attention of someone for whom the reflex had not worn off in decades. A school group from what appeared to be a regional high school had positioned itself in a row near the back, students' phones being quietly managed by two chaperones working with the particular focused energy of adults doing two things at once. 3 small children near the east edge of the rope were sharing one American flag on a stick, and the youngest of them, perhaps 4 years old, had stopped watching the flag and was watching the sentinel instead. Near the back, separate from the others, stood Edna Marsh. She had arrived at 7:32 with a care facility aide named Sandra, who now stood at a respectful distance, close enough to respond and far enough to understand that proximity was not what Edna had made a 2-week appointment and a signed physician's form to obtain. She wore a dark wool coat pressed as carefully as her hands allowed, and pinned to the left lapel, precisely centered over the heart, was a small bronze oval, bearing a caduceus at its center. She had worn that pin every day for 80 years. She had not explained it to a stranger in at least 40 of those years, and she did not explain it now. She held Lily with the authority of a woman who had held many things in many difficult places and had learned not to hold them too tightly. Lily Marsh was 2 years old, and she was Edna's great-granddaughter, and she had been told before leaving Fairfax County that they were going to see something important. She had not asked what important meant. She watched Jack's southward pass with an unbroken, patient attention that did not belong to a child her age, and that Edna, who had spent 8 decades among people maintaining attention under difficult conditions, recognized and acknowledged by adjusting the child's weight slightly, without saying anything about it. The crowd had arranged itself around them in the way Arlington crowds sometimes arrange themselves, not by instruction or any single person's agency, but by something older and quieter. A collective adjustment that left the old woman a clear line of sight to the mat without anyone having organized it. The space around her was perhaps 18 inches on each side, and no one who had opened it up could have said precisely when they had moved. Edna was 103 years old. She had been born in 1923 outside Charlottesville, Virginia, had completed nursing school at 19, and had been commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps in 1944 at the age of 21. She had served in a field hospital in England and then in France from that year through 1946, and she had done the specific, unrepeatable work of a military nurse during the last 18 months of the largest war in human history. She had come home. She had not spoken about it publicly in decades. The bronze pin on her lapel was the only visible mark of all of it, and it was very small, and if you did not know what a caduceus was, you would not know what you were looking at. Nobody on the plaza knew this yet. At 8:09, Derek Cass arrived at the plaza from the upper walkway with his phone already recording. He was 34 years old, and he ran a travel content channel with 312,000 subscribers, built on a combination of location footage and the kind of produced spontaneity that performed well with audiences who enjoyed watching a confident person navigate unfamiliar spaces without the camera ever letting on that it was all thought through in advance. His blue technical jacket photographed cleanly across light conditions, which was why he owned it. He moved through the gathered visitors with the comfortable momentum of a man who had been in many public spaces with a camera and had found consistently that the camera served as a form of social permission that other modes of arrival did not. He positioned himself at the rope, and within 1 minute had the phone at hip height, screen angled toward the mat. He stayed through one southward pass and one northward return. The guard did not look at the phone. The cadence did not alter. Derek straightened and brought the phone to chest height, and his expression carried the beginning of a recalibration, the quiet assessment of a man whose usual instrument had not produced the expected note, and who was deciding whether the instrument or the subject required adjustment. He leaned toward his companion. What he said in the low, comfortable tone of a man making an observation rather than a decision was that the guard looked like a toy soldier, and that he wondered if there was a person inside any of it anywhere, or whether they had just hired someone who didn't feel things. His companion said she was pretty sure they were volunteers. The man with the VFW cap, 2 feet to Derek's right, caught the edge of it. He pressed the cap a little more firmly to his chest and turned slightly away from Derek, which was neither confrontation nor agreement, but had a clear enough meaning for anyone who knew the register. Edna had not heard the words clearly from 8 feet back. She had read the lean and the companion's response and the veteran's posture, and she looked at Derek for a long, level moment before returning her attention to the mat. Jack completed his 12th pass of the morning. The crowd had grown to near 60 visitors. The school group in the back had reached the settled attention that the chaperones had been working toward for 20 minutes. The man with the VFW cap held his position with the patient steadiness of someone who understood that standing still in the right place at the right time was not passivity, but its own form of statement. The 3 children near the east edge had pressed closer to the rope, and the youngest was still watching Jack, had been watching for the past 4 passes, which was something. Correa at the north box had moved into the second hour stillness, the first hour tension released and replaced by the quieter, more even alertness of a man walking steps he no longer had to count. Jack registered it without turning his head. It was the reliable thing, the sign that the watch was holding correctly. Derek had repositioned twice along the rope, testing angles, and had produced nothing his own internal estimate of his channel's performance would classify as a moment. He had tried the low match shot, the full-profile pass capture, and a frame of the tomb's inscription against the sentinel's back, and in all 3 the cadence had continued unchanged. He understood this without altering his posture, because a changed posture was the kind of signal that produced an outcome before he was ready for it. He tried the low match shot a second time, holding the phone 8 inches above the black rubber, the screen showing Jack's reflection in the mat's polished surface. The reflection was sharp and perfectly inverted, the white gloves repeated beneath the feet that wore them. The cadence continued through it without variation. Derek held the angle for a long moment, then straightened up and checked the footage and looked at his companion with the expression of a man who has revised his estimate of a task's difficulty without revising his intention to complete it. The morning light had shifted higher and come in more directly from the east, and the chrome of Jack's bayonet was throwing a brief point of light against the tomb's marble on each rifle transfer. The smallest child near the rope reached toward it once with an open hand before her father gently drew the hand back. The inscription on the east face of the tomb was fully lit now, every letter standing in its clean declaration. Edna watched all of it. She watched the phone and the man behind it, and the angle changes, and the quiet conference with the companion, and the settling back into position. She had watched Jack complete, by her count, 15 passes since her arrival, and she had watched the way each pass was the same pass and also a different pass, a distinction she had the vocabulary for because it was the same distinction she had carried through 2 years of night shifts in a field hospital outside Reims, where every patient was a different patient, and the protocol was the same protocol, and the difference between the nurses who lasted and the ones who could not was the capacity to hold both of those things at once without letting either one consume the other. She understood what she was watching. Every person on that plaza that morning had come for their own reason. If this channel is new to you, the subscribe button below costs nothing, and the comments always stay open. Now back to the watch, and to what Jack Nguyen carried in his breast pocket. On the last southward pass, before the recalibration finished, Jack's right hand brushed the outside of that pocket during the 3-pace turn. The contact lasted 1 count. The breast pocket held a photograph. It was a 3x5 print of a young man in army dress uniform, taken at a studio portrait concession in San Francisco in October 1944. The kind of photograph a soldier arranged before shipping out because someone at home had asked for a copy, and because the base photographer offered a package rate, and because there was, in those months before the end of the war, a collective agreement among certain categories of young men not to examine too closely what the request implied. The young man in the photograph was 24 years old. He had a face that bore a specific resemblance to Jack Nguyen's own face. The same line at the jaw, the same quality of forward attention in the eyes. His name was Corporal Min Nguyen. He had been the son of Jack's great-grandfather's brother, and he had died on the 42nd day after that photograph was taken, when an artillery strike on a ridge above Lady Gulf killed him and 4 other soldiers of his company. The remains of 2 of those men were recovered. 3 were not. Min Nguyen was among the 3, and his name was cut into the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. And that wall was the only place on Earth where a family could go and stand in front of something that acknowledged he had existed. Except, perhaps, here. The tomb of the unknown soldier held the remains of one unknown from the Second World War, interred in 1958 without a name, given back every name the war had taken from every family that had never been given one in return. No DNA match had been made. The identity of the unknown could not be established by any method then available or since. Jack had done the arithmetic at 19 years old, standing in front of the tomb on a November afternoon before he wore any uniform, having grown up with the name Min Nguyen, spoken at the edges of family gatherings in San Jose, and having eventually asked enough questions to understand the full account. He had not come to Arlington that first day with a plan. He had come with a question. He had stood in front of the inscription and understood that the tomb was not claiming to hold Min Nguyen specifically. It was holding something more precise and more demanding than a specific claim. It held the space where every unidentified soldier remained present. The question sustained rather than resolved. The post kept not as an answer, but as the only response that honored the question correctly. He had enlisted that January. He did not carry the photograph as sentiment. He carried it because Min Nguyen was not absent in the way a living person is absent when they leave a room. A man who had shipped from San Francisco and died on a Pacific ridge and whose remains had not been returned was present in the specific way that the unresolved are present, without location, but not without weight. The weight was in the breast pocket. The weight was in each heel-to-toe step across 63 feet of black rubber mat. The weight was the reason that none of what the crowd was watching was a performance. He walked the 21 steps. On the other side of the rope, Derek Cass had moved to the nearest secondary boundary chain and was looking at it with the practical assessment of a man finishing a calculation. The chain hung between two short iron posts set inside the outer rope, a secondary perimeter closer to the mat, marked by a small sign on the nearest post, stating in plain text that crossing it was prohibited. Derek had read the sign and had filed it in the category he reserved for such signs in the course of his work, firm-sounding, rarely enforced, yielding in practice to a confident posture and an active camera. He had crossed similar posted limits on 2 previous assignments in the past 18 months and had been spoken to politely in both cases, and nothing more had come of it. He was 34 years old, and he had built 312,000 subscribers on the premise that the distance between a good video and a great one was usually a single decision made in the right moment. His companion looked at him. He put his hand on the chain. Derek stepped across the chain. His left foot came over the cable first, the rubber sole setting down on the restricted side without hesitation, and he straightened there and brought the phone up and said to the lens, in the comfortable tone of a man addressing an audience he already knew well, that they were going to find out together whether the toy soldier had a timer on him or whether there was actually someone in there capable of making a choice. Several people in the crowd heard it clearly. The man with the VFW cap turned from the mat to face Derek. He held the cap flat against his chest, and his jaw had the set quality of a man choosing between 2 responses and accepting the smaller one. The school group at the back had arrived at the particular quiet of adolescence, in a room where the adult authority has been replaced by something they do not have a name for yet. The 3 children near the east rope were drawn back from it by their father's arm, and the youngest, the one who had been watching Jack for the past several passes, was still watching Jack and not Derek at all. Edna had not moved. Jack was 14 steps into the northward pass when Derek cleared the chain. The remaining 7 steps ran at the same interval as the 14 before them, heel to toe, the polished shoe finding the mat at the same angle it had found on every previous pass of the watch. At the north end, the rifle transferred from right shoulder to left in one clean arc, white glove to white glove, and the turn position held its count. 21 seconds. In those 21 seconds, Derek stood on the restricted side with the phone at eye level, and his posture still carrying the ease of a man testing a hypothesis rather than managing a crisis. His angle did not change. His breathing was even. The crowd behind the outer rope held itself in the kind of anticipatory quiet that accumulates during long ceremonies when the interval before resolution has stretched past the audience's estimate of how long it should take, and the prolonging has begun to feel like its own instruction. The 21st second arrived. Jack stepped south. He completed 6 steps. On the 7th step, he stopped. The stop occupied no more space than a step would have. It was the same economy of motion that governed every action at the mat, the minimum sufficient to accomplish the required outcome. one stride withheld at the precise point the circumstances required withholding. His posture did not change. His chin remained at the level the uniform required. The rifle remained at left shoulder arms with the same grip pressure the white gloves had carried throughout the full watch. He turned from the southward axis to face Derek Cass in a single measured rotation. And in the quiet of the plaza, in the moment before he spoke, the crowd stopped breathing in the collective, involuntary way of people who have been waiting for something specific for 40 minutes and are now watching it arrive and finding it smaller and more final and more precise than anything they had imagined. He said, in the level procedural register he used for every certified action at this post, without raising his voice and without lowering it, "Sir, step back behind the rope line." The plaza held that line. Nobody moved. The chrome of the bayonet caught the direct light, and the inscription on the east face of the tomb stood in its carved declaration above the man who had spoken, and the crowd breathed in the particular suspension that is not the breath-hold of shock, but of recognition, the moment a thing that has been building for a long time arrives in exactly the form it was always going to arrive in, and settles into the space the morning prepared for it. The school group at the back was so quiet that the nearest chaperone later said she had thought, in those first few seconds, that some of the students had stopped breathing too. The man with the VFW cap pressed it harder against his chest. The three children near the east rope were very still. The youngest had her father's arm around her, and her eyes on Jack's face, and she did not look away. Derek's phone remained at eye level for 2 full seconds after the line landed. The recording light stayed red. The screen showed whatever it was pointed at. And whatever it was pointed at was a man in an old guard dress uniform, standing on a rubber mat in front of a white marble tomb, who had said 8 words at the volume of a normal conversation, and was now waiting with no apparent interest in what came next. The phone came down several inches. Derek said, in a tone that retained most of its earlier confidence but had lost the ease underneath it, that he was only filming and that this was a public space, and that public spaces did not have enforced exclusion zones, and that he knew this from direct experience across 100 locations. Jack had delivered the authority he held for this circumstance. He had no further authority to apply and nothing more to demonstrate through the use of words, and he waited with the specific quality of patience available to a man who has stood a 2-hour watch in the cold on multiple mornings and has not been in the habit of mistaking waiting for losing. What came next came from the administrative entrance to the plaza. Sergeant Paul Torres had been at the upper walkway for the past 4 minutes, positioned there from the moment Correa's posture at the north box had shifted from standard alertness into the specific, visible quality of a man watching a situation cross a threshold rather than approach one. Torres was 41 years old and had held the sergeant of the guard post on the tomb detail for 2 years, and he moved across the walkway and down to the plaza level with the unhurried pace of a man arriving at a task he understands completely, whose clarity about what is required has made urgency beside the point. He reached Derek's position in the time it takes a deliberate man to cover 30 feet without running. He positioned himself at Derek's left shoulder and said, at a volume calibrated for the nearest few people at the rope and not for the whole plaza, that the chain marked the protected perimeter of an active post, that the sentinel had issued a verbal warning under his documented authority to do so, and that Derek was going to step back behind the outer rope, collect his belongings, and exit the plaza. He said it once. He presented it as a sequence of events that had already been determined, not as a proposal to be negotiated. Derek's companion had already crossed to the outer rope. Derek looked at Torres. He looked at Jack, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed, and who was not going to offer him anything further in any available register. He looked at the phone in his own hand, and then at the crowd behind the outer rope. And in his expression in that moment was the particular quality of a man whose prepared script has run past its last prepared line and who is revising under observation without the benefit of an edit. He stepped back across the chain, at the outer rope, collecting the bag his companion had held during the preceding minutes. He said at a volume that implied an audience he was no longer certain of, that he had press access from national monuments across the country and credentials from major institutions, and that someone who walked a rubber mat all day like a wind-up toy while the public funded the whole production was not in any reasonable position to give him instructions about where the camera was allowed to go. Nobody at the rope said anything back to him. Torres walked him to the upper walkway. The walk took less than a minute. At the top of the steps, Derek said something in the lower register of a man addressing himself as much as anyone else, and Torres did not answer it. The plaza settled back into its morning quiet, the kind of quiet that returns to a space after something has been corrected and before anyone has decided how to speak about what they witnessed. Jack had completed the south turn before Torres cleared the top step. It was the veteran in the windbreaker who said it. He was perhaps 68 years old, with a small service insignia on the left breast of the jacket that identified his service without advertising it, and he had stood at the rope for the better part of an hour without speaking. He said it quietly, in the considered voice of a man naming something he has been holding for several minutes and has decided deserves to be named aloud. He was not addressing the crowd. He was making an observation to the woman nearest him, and what he said was that the woman near the back, with the child on her hip, was wearing an Army Nurse Corps pin. He was looking at Edna. The woman standing next to Edna turned and looked at the lapel. The pin was small and bronze, a caduceus on an oval face, pressed to the dark wool above the heart. She asked Edna, quietly, when. Edna said, 44 to 46, England, then France. The veteran in the windbreaker brought his right hand flat to his chest, over the insignia on his jacket, and held it there. The recognition moved through the rope line in the way that a correct identification moves through a gathered room when the people in it already carry the vocabulary for what they are being told. Not fast, not announced, through any raised voice or organized signal. People turned toward Edna. Some of them understood immediately. Others looked at the pin and looked at the veteran's hand and understood a moment later, the understanding traveling at the speed of people who need one additional piece of information before they know what they are standing in the presence of. The school group chaperone at the back said something brief to the teacher beside her, and two students turned with the careful, unperformed deliberateness of young people who are choosing to do a genuine thing rather than a prompted one. The man with the VFW cap, who had returned to his position at the center of the rope after Torres departed, lifted the cap to a higher point against his chest, his old reflex completing a gesture the morning had fully earned. Near the far end of the rope stood the woman with the gold star pin, who had said nothing all morning. She looked at Edna, and then at the mat, and then down at her own hands resting on the rope cable. What passed across her face was not grief exactly, but the recognition of a grief that had found its matching shape in an unexpected place, and that finding was its own form of quiet relief, the specific relief that comes from discovering you are not holding something entirely alone. Sandra, who had known Edna for 4 months and had helped her dress that morning, and had coordinated the physician's authorization and the transport from Fairfax County, stood slightly behind Edna's right shoulder and was becoming acquainted, in the manner of a person standing still in the presence of information they had not been given, with the full account of who she had brought to Arlington on a clear Friday morning in May. Edna did not make a speech. She was 103 years old, and she had spent 2 years in a field hospital outside Reims, and had come home and had raised a family, and had outlived most of the people who had known her work during those 2 years, and the bronze pin was the only visible ledger of all of it. She adjusted Lily's weight on her hip and looked at the man in the windbreaker and said, "Thank you." And he said it back to her with a directness that acknowledged they were not exchanging pleasantries, but were completing a transaction that the country had left open for 80 years. Lily was not watching any of this. Lily was watching Jack. She had been watching him since the first resumed stride after the south turn. The same steady, unbroken attention she had brought to every previous pass of the morning, and she was 2 years old and had not yet acquired the adult habit of deciding in advance what importance looks like before it arrives and then measuring what appears against the prior decision. Her eyes tracked the white gloves and the chrome of the bayonet and the heel-to-toe passage across 63 feet of black mat, and she held Edna's shoulder with one open hand and watched without looking away. The morning was fully arrived now, the pale quality of the early hour long since resolved into the even brightness of a late spring midday. The light came in direct and flat across the full face of the tomb and the full length of the mat, leaving no shadow at the mat's surface, and the inscription on the east face stood in its complete clarity, each letter filled with its own clean line. The chrome of the bayonet was very bright on each transfer. The white of the gloves was very bright against the dark stock on each pass. At the south turn, in the 3-pace count, Jack's right hand rested one brief beat against the outside of his breast pocket. The photograph inside was 3 by 5. The young man in it had been 24 years old when it was taken, at a studio portrait concession in San Francisco in October 1944, and his face carried the same line at the jaw and the same quality of forward attention in the eyes as the face of the man who had placed it there that morning in the changing room at Fort Myer before the watch began. He had died 42 days after the photograph was taken on a ridge above Leyte Gulf. His remains had not been recovered. His name was cut into a wall in Manila, and the tomb at the end of this mat held an unknown from his war, and the identity of that unknown had not been established by any available method, and the question that absence held open was the same question Jack Nguyen had stood in front of at 19 years old on a November afternoon and had declined to walk away from. The Post did not resolve that question. The Post sustained it in the only form that honored what could not be closed. The turn completed. The northward pass began. Correa was at the north box in the second-hour stillness, his posture settled and even, his attention moving along the rope line with the regular, unhurried rhythm of a man for whom holding steady has ceased to require effort because it has become what he simply is. Jack registered it without turning his head. The watch was holding correctly in both its positions the way it was supposed to hold. Edna was still at the rope. She had been at the same position since 7:32, 8 feet back from the black cable with Lily on her hip and the bronze pin on her lapel, and the full morning account of what she had come to witness settled into her face with the quiet of a woman who had expected to receive something true and had received it. The crowd around her had arranged itself into the open space it had opened hours earlier without instruction, and that space had not closed, and the people at its edges were not looking at the mat anymore, but at Edna, and then at the mat and back, as though the morning had given them 2 things to witness, and they were deciding, in the private accounting of a crowd, which of those things they would carry home. Lily's crown rested against the underside of Edna's jaw, the child's weight carried in the practiced architecture of an arm that had held many things across a long life and had learned to hold without gripping too hard. Her eyes were on the mat and on the white gloves and on the measured heel-to-toe passage that had been the only consistent sound in the plaza since before 8 o'clock, and the morning was very quiet around her, and the marble was very white behind the man she was watching, and her attention did not move. The boots found the mat. The 21 steps continued.